Hello, today is Tuesday, June 9th, 2020. I'm Joe Schmidt from TC2, and this is Staying Connected. This is the first installment of a two-part podcast on a topic that is very familiar to you if you are a longtime listener to these podcasts, and that topic is the Universal Service Fund, or USF. More specifically, we're going to talk about the costs imposed by carriers on enterprises in the form of a USF surcharge that is applied to certain telecom services. On today's podcast, I'm joined by my colleagues, Andrew Brown, the Managing Partner of LB3, and Andrew is also the Chairman of TC2, and Theresa Knutson, a fellow director at TC2. Andrew and Theresa, when the three of us last got together about 2 years ago to talk about this, the factor had then hit an all-time high of 19.5%. Andrew, you basically offered a very gloomy prediction about how much more expensive USF was going to get for enterprise customers. Sure enough, when we talked again last year, factor had hit 24.4%, and you said it was likely to continue increasing. So, Andrew, what's happening now?
Well, first, I take no pleasure in these gloomy predictions coming true, but looking back on our past conversations, I wish we could have that 19.5% or even that 24.4% back.
Really? So what is the new factor for the upcoming quarter?
You ready? For the upcoming third quarter, the USF factor is going to be 26.5%. That is another all-time high, and by any measure, that's totally crazy. I mean, what other purchase do consumers make that imposes what is basically a 25 to 30% surcharge on the service?
Well, that is a big number and quite a jump from the contribution factor in the second quarter.
Yeah, it's a huge number and a huge increase, and the big changes in the factor from quarter to quarter are almost as problematic to enterprises as the actual net cost that they have to pay. It's not like a predictable 3% annual increase that you can actually budget for every year. So just look at what happened here. I mean, the factor went up by 35% from last quarter's assessment. Who plans for a 35% variability in any cost component? I mean, you guys see firsthand how difficult it is for clients to build this kind of variability into their annual budgeting process because it's such a big unknown. This drives Theresa crazy.
Yeah. Well, Andrew, there are a lot of things that drive me crazy, but this one in particular, because it's hard to budget for. So keep in mind that corporate finance's goal is all about avoiding unexpected surprises. And it's virtually impossible to budget or to forecast for a surcharge that changes quarterly and one that continues to increase significantly. And get this, there are other non-USF carrier fees that are counted as revenue that are also assessed USF. So think about things like property tax assessment, administrative expense fees. Those added surcharges are also added USF. So as the base USF factor increases, it has a trickle-down impact on these other fees, which effectively cost you more money than the amounts published by the carrier in their service guide. So it all adds up.
Well, the reality is that it's been around for a long time, and even though it's not ideal, companies do have to deal with it until the problem is fixed.
Right, they do, and that's why you want to make sure that your accounting team, or if you have a telecom expense provider or a TEM provider, that they have a separate GL account to track these telecom surcharges, taxes, fees. And that allows you to have data readily available at your fingertips, so when you're explaining budget variances to your CFO, it becomes a lot easier.
Andrew, we'll talk more in part 2 about why the factor keeps going up. But you said last year that the factor will get to the 25 to 30% range and that the problem would just continue to get worse. I think you memorably called it the USF death spiral. So I guess even though the jumps are big and unwelcome, and they're not exactly surprising or unexpected at this point, I guess you'd probably agree that that USF death spiral is indeed upon us.
Yeah, well, we've been in it for a while, so it is upon us and we're in it. And like any death spiral, I guess it's just getting faster and steeper. So predicting this is not crystal ball kind of stuff. It's just some basic math and understanding how messed up the USF funding system is. We can get into those details a little bit later in part 2, but people just have to understand that this problem has been with us for a while and it's going to stay with us for a while. So the real issue that enterprises have right now is that an increase like this, it's never a good thing, but the timing of it really couldn't be worse. I mean, the global pandemic right now has created a likely economic downturn, and that's going to potentially be significant, potentially long-term. And companies now get walloped with a 35% hike in USF charges just at the time they can't really afford any kind of increases in the cost for anything that they're buying.
And that does make it really important for customers right now to really drill down on what they're being charged for USF and all these other so-called taxes and regulatory fees.
Yeah, that's very true, Joe. And, USF has always been the mother of all the surcharges because it's so large and it can distort a lot of additional costs. So the days when you would negotiate whether you would pay for some or all USF are gone. But what really matters is how USF is applied, and it varies by supplier. So, for example, some suppliers will apply USF to MPLS access but not to ports. Other vendors charge separately for class of service, and those are assessed USF. So these distinctions are really important, particularly with USF at 26.5%, because it can add up to a lot of money. So you need to understand these differences and watch your invoices very closely.
And it's also important to understand that the combined total of USF and these made-up vendor so-called reg fees generally just goes up. It's sad but true. Even in those quarters when the USF factor goes down, we often see carriers take that as an opportunity to hike those separate reg fees so that the end user doesn't see any reduction in their overall cost for these charges. And then when you hit a quarter where the USF part goes back up, the overall cost of those fees goes up too, because it's not like the vendors go back and cut their reg fees once they've hiked them.
So, Theresa, I know you've seen some other bad things out there too, haven't you?
Yeah, and some of these numbers are really eye-popping. I'm actually working with 3 different clients right now who have taxes and surcharges on certain services that exceed 50%. So when we've talked to the vendor, they've admitted that the number seems wrong. They've gone back and they've said, okay, we can refund you for a certain period of time, but these discussions need to happen. USF at 26.5%, we've got these added reg fees that add another 13%. So before you get to state taxes and federal taxes, you're already at 40%. So you have to drill down and do an aggressive invoice review. You have to know that these reviews go typically beyond the capabilities of your TEM provider, and you can claw back some of that money. In particular, if you have UVN or dedicated access rings, make sure to take a look at the taxes and surcharges on those services. So review and discuss with your vendors.
And that's really very important right now, given the economic strains that companies are likely going to face in the coming months. Okay, that's the end of part 1 of this 2-part podcast series. Thanks, Theresa and Andrew, for a good rundown of the latest USF issues. In part 2, we'll talk more in depth about the problems with the USF system, why it's going to continue imposing even greater costs on enterprise customers unless the system is changed or enterprise customers deploy more services that are not assessed USF. In the meantime, if you do have questions or you want some additional information on USF, feel free to get in touch with one of the TC2 or LB3 professionals that you know or that you regularly work with to talk about USF, or if you have other ICT lifecycle needs. You can also check out our websites at LB3 and TC2. You can follow us on LinkedIn, and of course, you can subscribe to our podcasts on any number of podcasting platforms, including Apple, Google, and Spotify.